Welcome to the Dark Archive Bureau, sometimes simply called the Archive, where I, Fulcrum, dissect the minds behind the cases most people would rather leave closed. Some cases come in through Gateway with so much paperwork you'd think we were about to get audited. Seriously, sometimes you almost want to lock the office door before you even open the file. This case wasn't like that. Mercer actually handed this one to me as a joke, which honestly made sense at first. Usually, if someone keeps trying to steal a burger recipe from the restaurant across the street, you don't exactly call in a forensic psychologist. But the behavior kept going. New plans, new disguises, new machines. Every failure followed by another attempt. And after a while, you stop focusing on the crimes themselves and start noticing the pattern underneath them. Because at a certain point, this stops being about fast food. It becomes about obsession, comparison, resentment. The kind of psychological loop that forms when someone ties their entire sense of self-worth to a goal they can never quite reach. Oh, and just for context, the subject in question is approximately 2 inches tall and married to a sentient computer. Honestly, from a psychological standpoint, that only makes the case stranger. The name on the file? Sheldon J. Plankton. And the more I reviewed the case history, the harder it became to dismiss him as simple comic relief.
Welcome to Dark Character Profiler. Take a deep dive into the background and personalities of villains from books, video games, manga, and comics. Psychological analysis of some of the most deviant and heinous characters of all time. Now, here's Fulcrum.
Every story has a villain, but not every villain is simple. Here, we go beyond good and evil to ask harder questions. What shaped them? What broke them? And at what point does survival become monstrosity?
Dark Character Profile.
Listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of severe psychological trauma, violence, abuse, and exploitation. All analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional diagnosis, psychological treatment, or medical advice. The material is examined analytically and without glorification, but it may still be distressing. If you need to pause, skip, or step away, please do so.
Dark Character Profile.
Section 1. Basic Case Information. Subject name: Sheldon J. Plankton. Alias: Plankton. Narrative classification: recurring antagonist, comedic villain. Public persona: within Bikini Bottom, Plankton is largely viewed as a nuisance-level criminal, failed businessman, and chronic schemer whose repeated attempts to steal the Krabby Patty formula have become more comedic than threatening. Most residents don't see him as dangerous, just desperate. True persona: beneath the exaggerated presentation, however, the behavioral pattern becomes significantly more complicated. What initially appears to be petty criminal persistence gradually starts resembling long-term psychological fixation centered around inferiority, comparison, and unresolved identity failure. In simpler terms, this isn't just somebody trying to win anymore. This is somebody trying to prove they were never the loser in the first place. Core motivations. Based on observed behavioral patterns, the subject appears primarily motivated by recognition, validation, competitive superiority, identity restoration, and external proof of self-worth. Importantly, financial success alone does not appear sufficient to explain the fixation. The Krabby Patty formula functions less like a business objective and more like a symbolic psychological target tied directly to the subject's self-concept, which is a much bigger problem. Section 2. Developmental history. One of the more interesting things about this case is that Plankton's behavior doesn't really appear to come from a single catastrophic event. There's no major betrayal, no obvious childhood abuse narrative, no dramatic psychological break. Instead, the behavioral pattern seems to develop slowly over time through chronic comparison, repeated failure exposure, and unresolved inferiority. And honestly, that kind of thing can shape somebody just as deeply as a single traumatic event can. Foundational environment. Canonically, there's limited information regarding Plankton's early developmental environment, but the relationship history between Plankton and Eugene Krabs provides an important psychological baseline. The two did not begin as enemies. Early accounts suggest they once operated more like peers, two individuals with similar ambitions, similar intelligence, and overlapping business interests. That distinction matters, because psychologically, Plankton does not perceive Mr. Krabs as somebody fundamentally above him. He perceives him as somebody who was supposed to be his equal. And when one person succeeds while the other repeatedly fails, that comparison can become extremely difficult to emotionally process, especially for somebody whose self-worth is strongly tied to achievement and recognition. Significant psychological stressors. From a forensic perspective, the subject's most significant long-term stressor appears to be chronic comparative failure. In simpler terms, Plankton does not merely experience failure. He experiences failure while constantly being confronted by someone else's success. Every empty day inside the chum bucket exists directly beside the overwhelming success of the Krusty Krab. Every failed invention reinforces the same emotional narrative. Someone else achieved the life I believed I deserved. Over time, that kind of unresolved comparison can become psychologically corrosive, especially when the individual never fully adapts to the loss. Failure as identity. Most people eventually adjust after repeated failure. They pivot, reevaluate, change goals, or redefine what success even means. Plankton demonstrates remarkably little ability to do that. Instead, each failure appears to strengthen the fixation, which suggests the goal itself gradually stopped functioning as a practical objective and started functioning as an emotional necessity. And that's where the case starts to become psychologically concerning, because eventually the internal narrative shifts from "I failed" to "I am the failure." That transition is important. Once failure becomes identity-based, abandoning the goal no longer feels like simple disappointment. It feels like self-confirmation, which may explain why the subject continues pursuing the same objective despite overwhelming evidence that the pursuit itself has become maladaptive. Attachment and interpersonal functioning. Plankton's interpersonal patterns suggest a largely comparison-based attachment style. Most of his relationships become filtered through competition, validation, recognition, and perceived status imbalance. Even outside direct conflict, the subject consistently appears preoccupied with how he measures against others, particularly Mr. Krabs. This creates a pattern where emotional energy becomes invested less in connection itself and more in what the relationship symbolizes psychologically. In practical terms, Plankton does not simply want success. He wants proof that he should have succeeded too. Early warning signs. Long before the subject's behavior escalates into increasingly elaborate criminal schemes, several personality patterns are already visible: obsessive goal persistence, chronic resentment, externalized blame, compulsive comparison, and difficulty disengaging from perceived humiliation. Importantly, however, the subject does not initially present as sadistic, chaotic, or openly destructive. The fixation develops gradually, which makes the progression more psychologically believable and honestly a lot more relatable, because most people do not become consumed by obsession overnight. Usually, it happens slowly, one comparison at a time, one failure at a time, one unresolved resentment at a time. That gradual buildup may be the most important part of the entire case, because by this point, Plankton's behavior no longer resembles ordinary ambition. The subject isn't adapting anymore. He's looping. Same goal, same rivalry, same emotional outcome. Just bigger machines every time. Which brings us to the behavioral evidence itself. And honestly, this is where the case starts getting much harder to dismiss as comedy. Section 3: Behavioral Evidence. At this point in the file, the important question stops being, why does Plankton want the formula? And becomes, why can't he stop? Because once a behavior keeps repeating despite constant failure, the behavior itself starts telling you something psychologically. And in Plankton's case, the pattern is extremely consistent. Emotional regulation. On the surface, Plankton actually appears fairly emotionally functional. He's intelligent, adaptive, creative, and capable of sustained long-term planning. More importantly, he tolerates failure unusually well, at least behaviorally. Most individuals experiencing this level of repeated defeat would eventually disengage from the goal entirely. Plankton does the opposite. Every failed attempt is immediately converted into another plan, another machine, another strategy, another attempt to finally, quote unquote, fix the problem, which creates an unusual psychological contradiction. The subject demonstrates tactical flexibility alongside extreme motivational rigidity. In simpler terms, he can change the plan endlessly. He just cannot change the goal. And honestly, that distinction matters a lot clinically, because persistence by itself is not unhealthy. But when somebody becomes psychologically incapable of reevaluating the value of the goal itself, persistence can slowly turn into fixation. Failure response pattern. One of the clearest behavioral patterns in the case is the subject's relationship with failure. Plankton does not appear to emotionally process defeat in a healthy or adaptive way. Instead of reevaluating the pursuit, he consistently externalizes the setback. The plan was flawed, the machine malfunctioned, someone interfered, next time will work. The core objective itself is almost never questioned, which suggests the pursuit has become psychologically protected, meaning abandoning the goal would likely create more emotional distress than continuing to fail at it. And honestly, that's where obsession starts becoming self-sustaining. Empathy assessment. Empathy-wise, the subject presents as more complicated than most comedic villains. Plankton clearly demonstrates cognitive empathy. He understands how other people think. He manipulates emotions effectively, predicts reactions, and regularly designs elaborate social schemes around the behavior of others. So this is not somebody who lacks social awareness. Emotional empathy, however, appears much more inconsistent. The subject tends to prioritize his own frustration, humiliation, and perceived unfairness above the emotional experiences of others, particularly when those emotions interfere with the pursuit of the formula. That said, the subject does not appear broadly sadistic or emotionally detached in the way more severe antisocial personalities often do. Most of his harmful behavior appears goal oriented rather than cruelty oriented, which is an important distinction because Plankton does not seem especially interested in causing suffering for its own sake. He's interested in winning. Relationship style. Interpersonally, nearly every major relationship in the file becomes filtered through competition, validation, or insecurity. And nowhere is that more obvious than with Eugene Krabs. Psychologically speaking, Mr. Krabs functions less like a rival and more like a living comparison point. Every success Krabs experiences reinforces the exact insecurity Plankton cannot let go of, which is probably why the rivalry never burns out emotionally. The conflict is no longer practical, it's symbolic. Karen presents a very different dynamic. Interestingly, Karen may be the single most emotionally stabilizing relationship in the subject's life. She challenges him, criticizes his thinking, points out obvious flaws in his plans, and despite his ego, Plankton occasionally listens, which suggests the subject is not entirely closed off to emotional attachment or external feedback. The problem is that his fixation consistently overrides those corrective influences. SpongeBob, meanwhile, creates a different kind of psychological discomfort entirely. Because SpongeBob approaches relationships without the same obsession over status, comparison, or recognition. And honestly, Plankton never really seems to know what to do with that. He understands rivalry, competition, resentment, but genuine optimism and uncomplicated kindness seem to confuse him more than hostility does. Sense of self. The subject's self concept appears heavily externalized. In practical terms, Plankton's sense of value depends largely on proving something externally rather than internally maintaining self worth. This creates a fragile psychological structure where success becomes emotionally necessary rather than simply desirable, which helps explain why the formula itself becomes so psychologically important. By this point, it no longer represents business success alone. It represents validation, recognition, superiority, and emotional correctness. If the subject were ever forced to fully abandon the pursuit, he would likely also be forced to confront the possibility that the rivalry never ends in his favor. And honestly, that may be the single outcome he psychologically cannot tolerate. Moral reasoning. Morally, Plankton demonstrates a fairly classic entitlement based justification structure. He rarely behaves like somebody who believes he is fundamentally immoral. Instead, he frames his actions through perceived unfairness. In the subject's mind, the issue is not stealing is wrong. The issue is, why does Mr. Krabs deserve this more than I do? That distinction is important because once somebody becomes emotionally invested in correcting a perceived injustice, questionable behavior becomes much easier to rationalize internally, especially when the person already feels chronically overlooked, underestimated, or humiliated. And over time, that emotional logic can become strong enough to override ordinary moral restraint. Reaction to power and success. Interestingly, the subject does not appear motivated purely by wealth or practical success. If financial gain were the true objective, Plankton's intelligence and technical ability likely could have produced success elsewhere years ago, which means the fixation itself appears highly selective. The formula matters specifically because of what it symbolizes psychologically. And honestly, that may be the clearest evidence in the entire file that this stopped being ordinary ambition a very long time ago. By this point in the evaluation, enough behavioral evidence has emerged to begin examining the subject at a broader structural level. The question is no longer what Plankton does. The question is how his personality organizes itself around those behaviors. And for that, the archive turns to the hurricane scale. Section 4: Hurricane Scale Classification. At this stage in the evaluation, the archive applies what's internally referred to as the hurricane scale. Mercer originally designed the framework as a way to organize emotional and behavioral intensity patterns across long-term case studies. It is not a diagnostic instrument. It's a behavioral interpretation model. In simple terms, the scale measures how individuals psychologically navigate emotion, control, attachment, stress, instability, and interpersonal functioning. Category 1 represents manageable internal conditions. Category 5 represents severe psychological turbulence capable of destabilizing the individual or the people around them. And Plankton's profile ends up being unusually narrow. Most subjects fluctuate heavily across categories. Plankton doesn't. Almost his entire psychological structure keeps circling the exact same emotional conflict. Imagination and insight. Category 5. No question, this is the subject's strongest domain. Plankton demonstrates exceptionally high creativity, technical intelligence, and adaptive problem-solving ability. Across the case history, he repeatedly constructs advanced robotics, artificial intelligence systems, mind control devices, surveillance technology, and highly complex engineering projects. From a purely cognitive standpoint, the subject is remarkably capable, which honestly makes the fixation even more psychologically interesting. Because the intelligence is clearly there, the flexibility is not. The subject can reinvent methods endlessly, but he almost never reevaluates the emotional purpose behind those methods. In other words, Plankton's imagination is expansive. His insight into his own behavior is extremely limited. Control and order. Category 3. The subject demonstrates a moderate need for control, particularly regarding outcomes tied to the formula and the rivalry with Mr. Krabs. However, this does not appear to stem from perfectionism or compulsive orderliness. Instead, the control need seems emotionally tied to restoring perceived balance and correcting long-standing feelings of inadequacy. The irony is that most of the instability in the subject's life is self-generated. Nearly every crisis originates from another attempt to force resolution onto a rivalry that psychologically refuses to resolve itself, which leaves the subject trapped in a cycle of planning, failure, frustration, reconstruction, and renewed pursuit. Social energy, Category 2. Socially, the subject appears highly selective and functionally isolated. Most interpersonal engagement occurs through strategic cooperation, rivalry, manipulation, or validation seeking. Plankton rarely pursues connection for its own sake. However, the subject still demonstrates a clear desire for recognition and acknowledgement, which creates an interesting contradiction. Emotionally speaking, Plankton wants to be seen. He just primarily tries to achieve that through victory rather than vulnerability. And honestly, that tends to produce very lonely people. Compassion and cooperation. Category 2. The subject demonstrates situational cooperation, but limited emotional prioritization of others when compared against his primary fixation. Relationships consistently become secondary to the pursuit itself. That said, the subject does not appear broadly malicious. Compared to more severe antisocial personalities, Plankton's harmful behavior remains relatively targeted and emotionally specific. Most of the damage caused by the subject appears connected to obsession rather than cruelty, which matters clinically, because there is a meaningful difference between I want people to suffer and I no longer care what happens as long as I achieve the goal. Unpredictability, Category 3. Interestingly, Plankton is behaviorally less chaotic than he initially appears. The methods vary dramatically. The motivation almost never changes, which makes the subject psychologically predictable despite the increasingly elaborate schemes. Every behavioral path eventually loops back to the same emotional destination: the formula, the rivalry, the need for validation. At a certain point, the inventions themselves almost become psychological camouflage. Because underneath the giant robots and ridiculous plans, the emotional conflict remains exactly the same. And honestly, that consistency may be the single most revealing thing about the entire profile. Because by this stage, Plankton no longer resembles somebody pursuing success. He resembles somebody psychologically trapped inside a single unresolved emotional narrative. Which raises the obvious clinical question: are we looking at personality pathology, obsessive fixation, narcissistic compensation, or simply somebody who never learned how to emotionally let go of failure? That's where differential diagnosis becomes important.
And now, the final analysis. But first, just a little house cleaning.
Before we examine the crimes and potential diagnoses, a brief reminder: this analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only.
Dark character profile.
Section 5: Differential Diagnosis. At this point in the evaluation, the goal is not to force the subject into a single clean diagnosis. Honestly, personality doesn't usually work that neatly, especially in long-term fixation cases like this one. Instead, the objective is to examine which psychological frameworks best explain the behavioral patterns we've already observed. And with Plankton, several possibilities overlap. Some fit partially, some explain specific traits, but none completely explain the whole profile on their own, which ironically makes the case feel more psychologically realistic. Narcissistic personality features. The strongest personality features in the file are probably narcissistic in nature, though not necessarily in the exaggerated "I'm the greatest being alive" sense people usually imagine. Clinically, narcissistic traits often revolve around externalized self-worth, hypersensitivity to status, chronic comparison, validation dependence, and difficulty tolerating perceived failure. And Plankton demonstrates all of those pretty consistently. The subject clearly views himself as highly intelligent and chronically underestimated. More importantly, he appears emotionally preoccupied with the fact that somebody else, specifically Mr. Krabs, achieved the success he believes should have been his. That perceived imbalance becomes psychologically central to the entire case. However, the narcissistic traits appear relatively domain specific rather than globally pervasive. Plankton's entitlement and insecurity remain heavily concentrated around achievement, recognition, rivalry, and perceived status failure, which makes a full narcissistic personality disorder interpretation less convincing than a pattern of pronounced narcissistic traits and compensatory insecurity. In simpler terms, this looks less like grandiosity for its own sake and more like somebody trying to emotionally compensate for unresolved feelings of inferiority. Obsessive compulsive personality features. The subject also demonstrates several obsessive compulsive personality features, particularly involving rigidity around long-term goals. Importantly, this is not the same thing as classic OCD. The issue here is not intrusive thoughts or ritualized compulsions. It's psychological flexibility. Specifically, the inability to disengage from a pursuit long after the pursuit has become maladaptive. Most individuals eventually reevaluate goals after years of repeated failure. Plankton almost never does. Instead, the subject repeatedly modifies tactics while preserving the exact same emotional objective, which creates an extremely rigid motivational structure beneath otherwise creative behavior. And honestly, that contradiction may be one of the defining features of the entire profile. Persistent goal fixation. While not a formal DSM diagnosis, persistent goal fixation may actually explain the subject's behavior better than any single personality framework. Over time, the Krabby Patty formula stops functioning as a practical business objective and becomes psychologically symbolic. It represents validation, identity repair, emotional correction, and proof of worth, which means abandoning the pursuit would likely feel psychologically devastating to the subject, not because of the business loss itself, but because of what the loss represents internally. At that stage, the obsession becomes self preserving. The pursuit continues not because it works, but because emotionally, the subject no longer knows who he is without it. Antisocial and psychopathic features. Interestingly, the subject demonstrates relatively few traits associated with severe antisocial or psychopathic personality structures. Plankton manipulates others, lies frequently, engages in repeated criminal behavior, and occasionally demonstrates limited concern for consequences. However, several important psychopathic markers remain notably absent. The subject does not appear emotionally cold in a pervasive way, broadly predatory, sadistically motivated, thrill seeking, violence oriented, or emotionally detached from all relationships. In fact, many of his actions appear emotionally reactive rather than emotionally empty, which is a very important distinction clinically. Plankton is not somebody who seems incapable of emotional attachment. He's somebody whose emotional world has become severely narrowed by fixation and unresolved comparison. Trauma based explanations. Trauma based frameworks partially explain the case, though not in the traditional catastrophic sense. The subject's behavioral patterns appear tied less to acute trauma and more to cumulative psychological erosion, repeated humiliation, chronic failure, social comparison, unresolved resentment, and long term identity instability. Over time, those experiences seem to consolidate into a single emotionally dominant narrative. I should have succeeded. And once that belief becomes psychologically central, the rivalry stops functioning like competition and starts functioning more like emotional survival. Delusional or psychotic features. Importantly, the subject does not appear disconnected from reality. Plankton understands consequences, understands social rules, understands failure, and generally demonstrates intact reasoning and strategic planning ability. The issue is not psychosis. The issue is emotional rigidity. In other words, the subject is not detached from reality. He is trapped inside a narrative he psychologically cannot move beyond. Sadistic features. The subject also demonstrates very limited evidence of true sadistic motivation. Harmful behavior consistently appears instrumental rather than pleasure driven. Plankton does not usually pursue suffering for entertainment. He pursues victory, which again separates the profile from more severe malicious personality structures commonly seen in genuinely dangerous antisocial cases. Clinical synthesis. Overall, the subject appears best understood through a combination of narcissistic compensation, persistent comparative insecurity, obsessive goal fixation, and identity based external validation, rather than through severe antisocial pathology alone. And honestly, that distinction may be why the character feels strangely human underneath all the absurdity. Because psychologically speaking, Plankton's greatest problem is not that he lacks ambition, it's that he never learned how to emotionally survive failure. Section 6, Final Assessment. Looking at the full case history, the most important thing to understand about Plankton is that this was probably never really about the formula. Not psychologically, anyway. The formula just became the emotional container for everything else: failure, comparison, resentment, validation, self worth. Over time, all of it collapsed into one symbolic objective. And once that happened, the subject stopped chasing a business victory. He started chasing emotional correction, most likely interpretation. From a forensic psychology perspective, Plankton appears most consistent with persistent narcissistic compensation, chronic inferiority fixation, obsessive goal attachment, and externally dependent self worth, rather than severe antisocial pathology or psychopathy. The subject clearly demonstrates criminal behavior, manipulation, and repeated moral boundary violations. But the underlying emotional structure remains highly reactive, insecure, and comparison driven rather than emotionally detached or predatory, which is an important distinction. Because psychologically speaking, Plankton does not resemble somebody incapable of emotional connection. He resembles somebody whose emotional world gradually narrowed until almost every part of his identity became attached to one unresolved rivalry. Primary psychological driver. At the center of the case appears to be a very simple but psychologically powerful fear: the fear of being insignificant. More specifically, the fear that somebody else became everything the subject believed he was supposed to become. And once that belief takes hold strongly enough, the pursuit itself stops being optional emotionally. Winning becomes tied to identity. Letting go starts feeling psychologically equivalent to surrender, which explains why the subject continues the pursuit despite overwhelming evidence that it is actively consuming his life. Redeemability assessment. Interestingly, Plankton does not appear entirely unreachable psychologically. The subject demonstrates emotional attachment, occasional vulnerability, capacity for cooperation, responsiveness to feedback, and genuine frustration rather than emotional emptiness. In other words, there are still parts of the personality capable of functioning outside the obsession. The problem is that the fixation has become so deeply integrated into the subject's identity that abandoning it would likely require restructuring how he understands himself entirely. And honestly, that's a difficult process for anybody, fictional Plankton included. Final psychological insight. What makes Plankton psychologically interesting is not the criminal behavior. Compared to a lot of the files sitting in the archive, the actual crimes are relatively small scale. What matters is the emotional pattern underneath them. Because under all the machines, disguises, and ridiculous burger heists is a surprisingly human psychological conflict: the inability to let go of a version of success that never happened. And honestly, a lot of people experience some version of that. Most people just don't build giant robots about it. Closing. The longer I looked through this file, the less Plankton felt like a joke character. Not because he suddenly became dangerous, but because the emotional logic underneath the obsession started feeling recognizable. At a certain point, the subject stopped trying to build something meaningful for himself. Everything became about proving he should have won the comparison. And once somebody's entire identity gets tied to a single unresolved rivalry, letting go stops feeling like growth. It starts feeling like annihilation, which is probably why Plankton never really quits. Not because he believes the next plan will finally make him happy, but because somewhere along the way, chasing the formula became the only version of himself he still knows how to be. This file is closed, but not everything in the archive stays buried. I'll see you in the next case.
Dark Character Profiler.
Dark Character Profiler is produced and edited by Fulcrum under Dark Fulcrum Media. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following the show or sharing it with someone who loves psychology, storytelling, and morally complex characters. You can find links, references, and related material in the show notes. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters are rarely born. They're shaped.
Thank you for listening to Dark Character Profiler with Fulcrum. Listen every other Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Podcasts. Humanity was not meant to live this way. Society is left to the mercy of murderers and cutthroats. Hear Paige Zaplin Dam's epic tale brought to life in an audiobook. For years, Slade had felt secure in the forest. I am from simple, humble beginnings. I was raised in the Ironwood by an ogress, an Anaral. He saw immediately that she was beyond a healer's aid. Even a skilled witch could not help her recover from losing so much blood. Mother? Slade thought he wanted revenge. Instead, he got redemption. A kingdom of ash and steam, The Ogress's Son, a dystopian neo-dark age fantasy, narrated by Rich Frazier. Now available on iTunes and Audible. I promise you I will find whoever did this and avenge you, Mother.